Hello and welcome to this biology lesson on aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Very useful for students who are revising B2 module of AQA syllabus. What you need to know, the basic essential things about these types of respiration has been summarized on this page. So take some time to read through this page, and at any stage you can come to the first part of this video and have a read through this, because everything that has been summarized here is what I'm going to go through in this lesson with examples and illustrations. You must have heard about aerobics. Aerobics is a type of exercise which involves a lot of aerobic respiration, which uses oxygen by heavy breathing, and which does not result in cramps. So it uses a lot of oxygen gas from the air. Perhaps that will help you remember when you think about aerobic respiration, oxygen gas is involved. The opposite is true for anaerobic respiration. This is a type of respiration which happens without oxygen. Okay, let's have a brief introduction into what aerobic respiration is. Now, as you know from our lesson on cells and cell structures, you should be familiar with animal cell. And inside the animal cell you have parts called mitochondria, and this is where aerobic respiration happens. In fact, respiration happens inside mitochondria. We normally say most of the respiration reactions happen in the mitochondria. This is because respiration is not a one-step reaction, it happens in several stages. However, for GCSE, you just need to know one simple step. And that's why we say most of this particular reaction happens in mitochondria. Okay, so this is a process that happens in every cell of all living things. So do not think that this only happens with animals. This happens with plants as well. As you know, plant needs energy just like all other living things. So plants and animals, they all do same respiration, and we are looking at one particular type, aerobic respiration, which is basically a chemical reaction which involves oxygen and a fuel, in our case it's glucose, to produce energy. So that chemical reaction is such an important chemical reaction to carry out life's functions, and that happens inside every cell of our body, and it requires two basic ingredients in order to carry out aerobic respiration. Okay, we also should recognize that it is actually the enzymes that catalyzes this reaction, which means they speeds up these enzymes speed up respiration reactions. For aerobic respiration, a cell to happen inside the cell, it needs two basic reactants, which are glucose, which is the fuel, and oxygen, and they produce carbon dioxide and water. Okay, and in that process energy is released, and something to reckon. So it's really important that we realize the importance of that energy release, because that drives the life's processes for all life forms. And it is important to remember that most of this reaction takes place in this part, which is mitochondria. So some important facts on this page, so make sure that you remember all these facts. Here is a balanced simple equation for aerobic respiration. You can see oxygen is involved here, and that's the formula for glucose. So you have glucose here, oxygen, and it produces two products, carbon dioxide and water. So it is quite useful to know at this stage the role of heart and lungs in supplying the cells of the body or the tissues with glucose and oxygen. So let's get this is like a bigger picture. So what you have here is the heart, which pumps the blood around in the circulatory system. First of all, let's start here. Blood goes from the heart and it's pushed towards the lungs. And in the lungs, the blood gets oxygenated. So the blood over here has got low oxygen. Okay, so low oxygen at this point before it goes into the lungs. As it comes out of the lungs, it's got high oxygen here. So high oxygen concentration in the blood over here as it comes out of the lungs, and it goes to the heart. Heart again pushes it to the rest of the body. Okay, so every cell of the body is represented by this part here. This part represents body tissues where the blood supplies oxygen and glucose to the cells. So oxygen and glucose leaves in this part to the body cells. So this can be shown like this. O2 leaves the blood to the tissues. CO2 goes from the tissues to the blood. Okay, and the blood travels that way to the heart, and the heart pushes the blood to the lungs, and blood comes back to the heart this way. So I'm going to show another arrow here, and then the heart again pushes the blood through that main artery towards the rest of the body tissues. Okay, so that is another arrow that way. So you can see how the blood travels around, and we need to know this to get a good idea about how the body cells and tissues are supplied with oxygen and glucose, which is what aerobic respiration is all about. Now, once we understand how the circulatory system works and the role of heart and lungs, we should be able to appreciate what happens during exercise, which is what we're going to do next. Okay, let's have a look at what happens to the breathing rate and heart rate during exercise and explain why these changes do happen. This graph clearly illustrates what happens to the breathing rate really well. Now, if you can see in the 20 seconds at rest, that's not when the person is not during the exercise, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 breaths. So to calculate the breathing rate, you would do 5 times 3. As you know, there are 60 seconds in 1 minute, so we are converting this to 1 minute. So in a minute you get 15 breaths, and as you can compare that with during the exercise. You have 7 peaks here showing that 7 breaths have been taken. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So breathing rate during exercise has definitely increased, and it's 7 times 3, that's 21 breaths per minute. Okay, so that illustrates breathing rate becomes faster, and you can also see by the volume of air taken in during exercise is much larger than the volume of air breathed in at rest. Okay, so 2 main changes in the breathing during exercise is the breathing rate becomes faster and the breathed in air volume becomes higher. So a higher volume of air is breathed in during exercise. Now let's have a look at what happens during what's happened to the heart rate during exercise. In this example, we're going to compare the heart rate of 2 different people, John and David. John's graph is over here and David's is over here. Now you can notice the heart rate does not increase in the first 2 minutes. This shows that they only start exercising at 2 minutes. So the heart rate increases for 2 people at different rates, but the common thing to both of them is the heart rate does increase. Okay, which means the blood is getting pumped faster by the heart to supply the increased energy demand. Okay, so the heart rate increases for both of them, but you notice that John's heart rate is much higher than David's heart rate. This is because John's heart has to work at a faster rate to keep up with the energy demand. This shows John is less fitter. Either his heart is not able to supply the energy demand in the muscles, maybe because he is more heavier and overweight than David, or maybe his lung heart system is not as efficient as David's heart and lung system, which is also termed as cardiovascular system. Okay, so you can see David's heart rate goes up only up to 85, 86, whereas John's heart rate is about 105. And then you also notice that it takes much longer for John's heart rate to come back to his resting heart rate. His resting heart rate for John is just above 65, around about 67, and it hasn't reached back, it hasn't come back to the resting heart rate, which again shows John is less fitter. Look at David's heart rate comes back to his resting heart rate within like 2 minutes. As you can see, they have stopped exercising at 7 minutes, where both their heart rate starts to come back down from 7 minutes onwards. So you can see from 7 minutes it only takes like 2 minutes for David's heart rate to come back to his resting heart rate, whereas John's, from 7 minutes, it even after 15 minutes it has not reached his resting heart rate, which is here. So this shows again second reason why John or David is more fitter than John out of the two. So far we have seen heart rate and breathing rate both increase during exercise. Breathing is deeper, taking in higher volume of air with every breath. Okay, so these are the two main changes. The reason for these changes is this: to supply the muscle tissue which is exercising with more oxygen and glucose, or oxygen and glucose needs to be supplied at a faster rate, as now there is an increased demand during exercise. Another reason being to remove carbon dioxide from muscle tissues faster. Now, carbon dioxide is one of the waste products produced during respiration, and during exercise it is being produced at a faster rate. So the heart rate and the breathing rate has to increase to remove the carbon dioxide from the cells where they are produced at a faster rate. Okay, we know respiration produces energy, and we also need to know how animals and plants use the energy made in respiration. Okay, so in animals, to enable muscles to contract, and we know animals move about and plants don't. And for animals to move, it needs energy for the muscles to contract, and we know animals actually use their muscles to move, and for that they use the energy produced in respiration. In mammals and birds, they maintain a constant body temperature, and we know in mammals it's 37 degrees C. So to maintain that kind of body temperature, when particularly they are in colder surroundings, they have to produce this heat in the body, and that is done using the energy produced in respiration. Most living things produce larger molecules such as proteins from smaller molecules, and to do that they need energy, and that's from respiration. In plants, to build up sugars, nitrates into amino acids. So first of all, plants need to make amino acids. They use sugars and the nitrates from the soil. Sugars are produced in photosynthesis. They use these two to produce the smaller molecules, amino acids, which are then built up into even larger molecules such as proteins. Okay, so that to do that, plants use the energy produced in respiration. You need to recall all these facts and be able to describe exactly how plants and animals use the energy produced in respiration in both types, aerobic and anaerobic. You need to know how the energy is used by animals and plants. As you can see, animals and plants use the energy produced in slightly different ways. So make sure you know the differences between them. In fact, notice that this is the only thing which is specific to plants. So this is the main thing that plants do with the energy that's made. It's important to realize what happens during exercise and be able to describe the changes that happens in the heart rate as well as breathing rate. And as you can see, they're all linked. There is more energy demand in the tissues. So remember, this part represents the tissues, all the cells of the body is represented by this. So higher energy demand, as you know, during exercise muscles contract and keep contracting at a faster rate. So higher energy demand in muscles, that's the main thing during exercise. So which means it needs an increased supply of oxygen and glucose. Both arrives in the blood supply here. Okay, so the blood has to be supplied to the muscles at a faster rate. Okay, and that is done by increasing the heart rate. So the heart rate goes up, it pumps the blood faster, and the breathing rate also increases in the lungs, obviously to take in more and more oxygen to keep up with the demand in the muscle cells. Okay, and this is the summary of the changes that happens during exercise. Breathing rate increases and the breathing gets more deeper. Heart rate increases. The both changes are to supply more oxygen to the muscles, which where the energy demand has become higher because they contract much faster, so they need more energy supplied in the form of glucose and oxygen. Another very important fact that you're supposed to know is that muscles have a store of glucose as glycogen. So when people don't exercise, glucose gets converted to glycogen and it's stored in the muscles for use during exercise. And actually during exercise, muscles convert this glycogen back to glucose and use it to produce energy. So the blood has to only bring the oxygen for most part, although muscles do use the glucose, which is a ready source of energy first, and it also keeps converting the glucose in the muscles. So if the glucose does not arrive in the blood fast enough, muscles can supplement that by using the glycogen which is already stored in the muscles and convert that to glucose and use it to produce energy by respiration. Here you can see what happens to the glycogen concentration during exercise. So around about 60 minutes of heavy exercise, there is no more glycogen left in the muscles. So possibly past this point of heavy exercise, if a person is doing heavy exercise, it will be extremely hard to continue the exercise, as there are no energy reserves in the muscles. So if it does not reach through the blood as glucose, the person will not be able to continue the heavy exercise. And in the case of moderate exercise, it can go a little bit longer because the muscles can also use the glucose that arrives in the blood, plus supplement that with the glycogen stored in the muscles, then keeps it going for longer. So this time around it can go around for longer, 120 minutes with moderate exercise. Notice in light exercise the glycogen is not used at all because the glucose that is arriving in the blood is enough for a person to keep doing the light exercise without having to use any glycogen reserves or stores in the muscles. Now let's have a look at anaerobic respiration, which is another type of respiration. Energy is released here too, but this time around this happens because there is insufficient supply of oxygen coming from the blood to the exercising tissue and the cells. So cells demand for oxygen and glucose is very high, but the supply of oxygen is not enough. And that's when this type of respiration happens to keep the person exercising, keep the person going by still releasing energy. Energy is needed, but that is released by incomplete breakdown of glucose this time in the absence of oxygen. So no oxygen is involved here. No oxygen involved, and that's why it's called anaerobic respiration. So it's clearly that's the reason why there's no oxygen involved at all. So in fact, the equation for anaerobic respiration is this: glucose straight converted lactic acid, and some energy is released. So you have some energy released, which is much less than the complete breakdown. So when muscles respire aerobically by reacting glucose with oxygen, as we've already seen, it produces much more energy than the energy produced by this process. So it's really important to remember that the energy produced by anaerobic respiration is much less. Here's another problem with anaerobic respiration is this lactic acid. A buildup of lactic acid in the muscles cause muscle fatigue. So this is the reason for the cramps and fatigue in muscles, which stops the person doing exercise because it hurts. When there is a buildup of lactic acid in the muscles, it really starts hurting because of fatigue, and that prevents and stops the person from continuing the exercise for a longer duration because of the fatigue caused by the buildup of lactic acid. So this is the result of anaerobic respiration. Fatigue caused by lactic acid buildup causes this pain, which stops the person from continuing their exercise. For those students who are sitting higher tier need to know this, what is meant by oxygen debt. So you should be able to describe what it is. The lactic acid produced by anaerobic respiration has to be broken down by oxygen. So oxygen has to reach and flow through the muscles in the blood, where oxygen can react with the lactic acid to further break it down to carbon dioxide and water. So as you can remember from in anaerobic respiration, an incomplete breakdown of glucose takes place. Now this completes the whole process. So which means lactic acid is removed from the muscles. But to do this, normally after exercise, what people do is they continue their faster and deeper breathing, and that removes the excess lactic acid, because by doing so they are taking in more and more oxygen into the blood, which travels to the muscles where it reacts with lactic acid to remove it. So this whole the amount of oxygen needed to actually break the lactic acid down to carbon dioxide and water is known as the oxygen debt. Make sure you read this and know the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, and this serves as a summary of what we have seen so far about each type of respiration. Now you should be in a stage where you should be able to look at some data and be able to describe the trend it shows and be able to explain what you observe and link information, come up with some explanations with your knowledge on aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And this is a typical data that an example of a data that you get in the exam, where you'll be asked to describe what this shows. This data gives information about the type of respiration that is mainly used in different types of running races. So for a short distance running race like 200 meters, you can see less of aerobic respiration is used and more of anaerobic respiration used. As distance increases, the aerobic respiration contribution increases. So most of the energy is from aerobic respiration if the distance of the race is higher. Okay, and the anaerobic respiration is higher where the distance is shorter. So the shorter the distance is, the higher is the anaerobic contribution of the respiration. So what this shows is both respiration takes place, but for a short distance runner, most of the energy comes from anaerobic respiration. For a longer distance runner, most of the energy comes from aerobic respiration. You should also give some examples from the data when you actually tackle questions like this in the exam. Typically you can choose something that doubles. So you can choose from 400 to 800 or 200 to 400. So 200 meter runners use 71% anaerobic respiration and 29% aerobic respiration. And as you can see, when you double that to 400 meters, the aerobic contribution increases to 43%. Say how it changes, instead of saying changes, say increases to 43%. And the anaerobic respiration or anaerobic contribution, or the percentage of anaerobic respiration, decreases from 71% to 57%. The graph over here shows the trend even more clearly. So you may be asked to interpret graphs like this. What you can see here is people who are sprinters, who run very short races, like 100-meter races. They use mostly anaerobic respiration. As you can see, about 82% of the energy comes from anaerobic respiration, and that trend continues. So the longer they run, so the longer the race is, the less is the anaerobic contribution of respiration. So less and less energy comes from anaerobic respiration, and more energy comes from aerobic respiration. If you look at like 3,000-meter race, people who run a 3,000-meter race, most of their energy comes from aerobic respiration. As you can see, 90% of the energy for their race comes from aerobic respiration. That kind of trend you should be able to describe, and we're going to apply what we know from these charts and graphs on the next part. Okay, let's have a look at part 2 of the previous discussion, for which we're going to look at a table of information which is similar to the kind of information that's provided in exams. Okay, and you also have a question which uses the information from the table. What you have here is some information about two different types of muscles that all people have. One type of muscle is the slow twitch one, and the other type is fast twitch one. I'm only focusing on the yellow and the green columns, just to show the two main different types of muscles that people have. Now, for athletes, it's different. The proportion of these muscles is different depending on what type of races they do. So we are looking at athletes who run races. So those who run long distance races, such as marathons, they have more proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers. The athletes who do short distance races, such as 100 meters, 200 meters, sprinting races, they have this type of muscle, a higher proportion of a fast twitch muscle. So this proportion actually determines what type of race people are suitable for. Okay, so there is some basic difference between the types of muscles. So, and we'll go into the question later on. So let's have a real comparison of these two types of muscles. You can see instantly that these muscles, fast twitch muscles, contract very fast. The contraction time is very quick. And the slow twitch muscles, as the name indicates, that the contraction time is longer. So it contracts slowly. Okay, so that means people who have this twitch muscle, this type of muscle, or a higher proportion of the fast muscle, are more suitable for short distance running. As you can imagine, they have to the speed matters, whereas here the speed does not matter for marathon runners. Okay, so that's first thing to notice. The fatigue resistance is very high for people who have a high proportion of this type of muscle, slow twitch. But those who have the higher proportion of fast twitch muscle, the resistance to fatigue is low. What that means is people who run marathon are less likely to suffer from fatigue and excess lactic acid buildup and oxygen debt. So they will not suffer more from this fatigue, whereas those who run short distances, who have a higher proportion of fast twitch muscles, are likely to have fatigue and higher lactic acid accumulation and higher oxygen debt. So, okay, and the question based on this table is this: marathon runners after a race take 1 minute of faster and deeper breathing. Okay, so 1 minute of deep, fast breathing was enough to overcome their oxygen debt, and it becomes, the breathing rate becomes normal after that. So in effect, what the question is asking is, the marathon runners have a lower oxygen debt because it takes a very short time to pay back the oxygen debt during their race. Okay, on the other hand, the sprinters, they have only short distance to run, but they need 5 minutes of deeper breathing after their race. 5 minutes of faster and deeper breathing. So this means they have more of an oxygen debt. How do we explain that? Look for more information in the table in terms of mitochondrial density. Now, aerobic respiration takes place in mitochondria, and you have more mitochondria here in the slow twitch type, whereas you have low number of mitochondria in the muscles, in the fast twitch type muscles. So this means more aerobic respiration can take place in people who have more proportion of slow twitch muscle, which means the marathon runners will have more of aerobic respiration compared to the short distance runners with low mitochondrial density will have more anaerobic respiration. The aerobic respiration happens mainly in the mitochondria. Okay, so because they have a high number of mitochondrial density, or mitochondrial density being higher in this type of muscle, people who run marathons, though, and knowing that they have a higher proportion of this type of muscle, they would respire aerobically, more aerobically than anaerobically. So they only need a very short time to recover, or the oxygen debt is very low. Now, there is also another reason here. If you notice, the blood capillary, which means the slow twitch muscle, has got a very good supply of blood. So because it got a very high number of blood capillary density, whereas if you look at the fast twitch muscle, they have low blood supply, which means this facilitates, having a good supply of blood facilitates aerobic respiration, whereas you have low blood supply, low oxygen supply, automatically means that people who have a higher proportion of fast twitch muscles, which is the short distance runners, are more likely to respire anaerobically in these type of muscles, which means that increases their oxygen debt. That means they have to breathe for a longer duration, which in this case is 5 minutes. You should also explain this on the basis of the good or a better blood flow to the slow twitch type muscle. A higher blood flow will break down any accumulated lactic acid, allowing the oxygen debt to be cleared much quicker. And that is another reason for why the marathon runner only needs a minute of deeper, faster breathing. Okay, so when the blood flow is higher, this allows the oxygen debt to be paid back faster. So here is how a model answer would look like. So make sure you read this and understand the discussion that we had so far. This nicely summarizes the description and explanation of the information given in the table, and that's a typical exam question, and this is how you would answer it. Let's have a look at this graph or the chart, bar chart, which shows similar ideas, and this is a typical kind of data that's given in exams where you will be required to interpret and explain or use the data as it is to make decisions. Okay, so let's focus on just this part here, this bar here and this bar here, where you can clearly see a world-class sprinter, a fast runner, has a 20% of the slow type muscle fibers compared to 75% of the fast type muscle fibers, and this is what we discussed so far. And this graph only adds more evidence to that and to support what we've been discussing so far. And you can see the marathon runner has got a higher proportion of in fact 75% of the slow type muscle fiber, and 20%, it's just the opposite of that, 20% of the fast type muscle fiber. Now, muscles from people can be sampled and analyzed. A very small amount of muscle can be analyzed to find out what percentage of each type of muscle fibers people have. Particularly, this analysis can be done on athletes, and when an analysis is done, you can pretty much decide on which type of race is suitable for them depending on the percentage of the muscle type that they have. So what kind of questions can be asked on this data? You can simply be asked to describe what this data shows. So in this case, you should be able to say that the athletes who run shorter distance have a higher proportion of the fast type muscle, and that's what it shows. And the longer the race run by the athlete, the smaller is the proportion of the fast type muscle. Okay, and as the distance run by the athlete increases, so athletes who run longer distance races have a higher proportion of the slow type muscle, and that is the trend shown by this bar chart. Another type of question could be asking you to make a decision on a given scenario. Okay, so if a person X has a person X has got 73% slow type muscle. Okay, what would your advice be? And if this person is an athlete who wants to train to win races, what type of race you would train them in? Longer distance or shorter distance? As you can see, if they have 73% of slow type muscle, it matches with this. So you would train them or advise them to train to become marathon runners rather than sprinters, because their muscle type is more suitable for longer distance races. Time to check your progress. You should now be in a position to describe aerobic and anaerobic respirations with word equations. You should know which ones are reactants and products in both types of reactions. You should also be able to compare the energy produced by these types of respirations. As you know, anaerobic respiration produces less energy. And you should also be able to explain that. Okay. You should be able to explain the differences in oxygen debt using given data. Okay, for instance, if you're told or given some idea about some circumstances which produces more lactic acid, then it will require more oxygen debt. So depending on what you're given, you should be able to explain the differences in that. So that is a higher level of skill, but I suppose you should be able to do that. You've seen one example of that in this clip. Okay, number 4, describe any trends shown by the data. We've seen one example in this clip, and be able to analyze any given data on aerobic and anaerobic respirations. So that is even higher, be able to connect and link all the ideas together. So if you're able to do all of that, then you have understood most of this tutorial. So hopefully you understood, and it's been useful spending your time watching this. Thank you, and I will see you in my next lesson. Bye.